Welcome back to our series on important Galicianers, Galician Jews of the past 2 centuries. We now enter the mid to late 19th century where there are important changes happening in Galicia. Germanization efforts of both the Austrian state and the Haskalah did not penetrate the traditional masses, but it did affect the growing elite. And until the 1870s, this was the path of integrated Jewish identity. Increasingly, it was not just masculine who were committed religious Jews seeing integration as wholly compatible, indeed the most authentic expression of Jewishness. Increasingly, it was the rise of economic elites disconnected from religious Judaism, embracing a German identity but maintaining Jewishness as a religious or even as a sort of ethnic affiliation, barely expressed religiously. Perhaps the greatest and most influential expression of this was Karl Emil Franzos, one of the most connected and influential writers of the late 19th century German-speaking world. Franzos, writer, novelist, journalist, and publisher, was born in the East Galician town of Chortkov, home of one of Galicia's most famous Hasidic dynasties. He was born at the climax of the liberal revolutions of 1848. And although his family has Sephardic and French roots, by the mid-19th century, Habsburg Galicia, his father, a medical doctor, raised him to be deeply committed to German national identity and highly educated in German culture. They reject the traditional Jewish religious beliefs and cultural practices. As a modern German Jew, they were rejected by almost everyone. Other Jews, Poles, the Austrian state, and later even many German nationalists rejected them due to rising anti-Semitism. In fact, in those days, in the 1850s, only the Ukrainians had room for these potential allies of German Jews. And in the case of his father, they were actually quite attracted to him because he had treated many of them for free. With Franzos, his Ukrainian nanny had taught him the Ukrainian language and culture, to which he remained warm his entire life, far more so than to the Poles and even in many ways to Jews. This is reflected, by the way, in 1873 during parliamentary elections. Ukrainians, early Ukrainian nationalists, and German Jews organized an alliance against the Poles in the 1873 elections, which reflects this relationship. Only later, as Ukrainian-Jewish economic competition heightens, does anti-Semitism change that relationship, but by then, Franzos was already gone. After his father's death, the family moved slightly east to Czernowitz. Here on the map you can see it, the capital of Bukovina. Although it was further east, in many ways it was a greater stronghold of German culture, of Germandom. It was a far more multinational place. There was no single nationality that dominated, and it becomes a place of German-Jewish, not hegemony, but certainly German-Jewish flourishing. There he attends gymnasium, secondary school, before studying law in Vienna and Graz, joining and leading German national student associations along the way. He also left Galicia, that means, before the rise of Polonization, which we'll see with our next biography. Franzos remained convinced that German culture, which he understood as fundamentally liberal, to be the highest expression of humanity. But he also remained proud of his Jewish identity. Despite total ignorance or interest in religious life, he felt duty-bound to retain his Jewishness, despite it costing him job prospects in education and law, and costing him marriage with a woman whom he deeply loved. This was deeply embedded in him. There was a famous story of Franzos when he was just 10 years old, attending the theater, and the culmination, at one point, the actor on stage shouts, "We don't need any Jews in this country," and his friend whom he had brought with him applauds with the rest. Franzos nearly started a riot when he slapped his friend for applauding. He even spent time later in life visiting Jewish sections of East Galicia and Bukovina and further east to learn more about Jewish customs, travels which become the basis of his most famous literary works. Franzos slowly achieved success in journalism and writing and editing some of the leading journals in Vienna and later Berlin, where he moved in 1887. For example, from 1882 to 85, he is the editor of the Neue Illustrierte Zeitung, a very prestigious paper in Vienna, and in 1886, he founded the Deutsche Dichtung, which he edited himself. He even grew close with the son and heir apparent of the empire, Crown Prince Rudolf, although the latter sadly committed suicide in 1889. He was incredibly productive, particularly in light of his relatively young death, brought on probably by exhaustion and overwork, publishing some 24 books on top of all of his countless articles in the many journals where he worked or edited. But his most famous and influential work was certainly his depictions of East European Jewish and Polish-Ukrainian life. For example, his first work of this nature, Aus Halb-Asia, From Half Asia, was a series of cultural pictures in 1876, followed by Die Juden von Barnov, the Jews of Barnov in 1877, and eventually others like From the Don to the Donau in 1878, and Moskau from Parma in 1882. By 1894, Die Juden from Barnov, and this was based closely on his hometown of Chortkov, was translated into 16 languages. These works exoticized Galician Jews for Western entertainment, but also were part of his project highlighting the superiority of German nation and culture over the benighted Jewish masses of the East, hence the title Half Asia. Here he popularized and embedded not only some anti-Semitic ideas, but also internal Jewish ideas about the Galicianer as cunning, as ignorant, as a money grubber, as superstitious, a religious fanatic, as a spineless compromiser, vulgar in language, demeanor, hygiene, and more. The ideas, frankly, that this series is hoping to belie. The very term Moshko becomes a standard derogatory slang for a Jew with these connotations for decades. Franzos likewise claimed to have coined the then popular phrase, Jedes Land hat die Juden, die es verdient. Every country has the Jews that it deserves. And yet, this was some of his best work, inspired by his own experiences and written in superb German language. Moreover, he genuinely sympathized with them and considered positive aspects of their society too, such as their emphasis on familial love. But he felt convinced that they needed guidance, quote, good and educated men who ennoble and defend them. Despite the precipitous rise of anti-Semitism in the late 1870s and lasting almost until his death, he remained proudly Jewish, but also proudly German, strongly rejecting the nascent Zionist movement. The solution for the Jewish question lay in cultural assimilation, meaning then acculturation and integration into the West European nations. As he writes on the screen, I synthesized Germandom and Jewry into one single whole. Of both I heard only the most honorable, that which could inflame my enthusiasm. And note, this was a liberal nationalism, freely chosen via cultural and political affiliation, not by birth or race. Franzos remained since 1887 in Berlin, pursuing the same identity and cultural project forged in Chortkov and Czernowitz. His funeral on January 31st, 1904, was a widely covered social event, attended by family but also scholars, local writers, and journalists. The two eulogies given symbolize his life well, one by the Reform rabbi of Berlin, Rosenzweig, and the other by the Germanist Ludwig Geiger, with a German language epigraph of humanism on his gravestone. But it's in Chortkov that a monument with his carved image stands to his memory with Ukrainian signage on the side. The secular German Jew came home to Galicia. Thank you.